Well, hello everybody. There's something appropriate that it is. I'm here in Boulder, Colorado. It's 4:20 in the morning. So I'm not seeing. Let's see the slideshow.
The first slide is on.
Okay, the first slide is through Colorado at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, where we are 1 mile high above sea level, and it is definitely the high country for more reasons than one. I wish I could be there with you in person, but I'm very grateful and honored to be connected as we are. Next slide. First, let me say it's fantastic to be living in the first place on earth in only 50 years where adults are free to grow, buy, and use cannabis just as we use alcohol and tobacco. And I'm so grateful to be here in this circumstance, and it is the goal of me and all my friends to have this freedom spread and shared around the world. Make no mistake, this is about freedom and nothing else. So I'm going to tell you a bit about how it came to be, knowing how important it is for all of us to be free. Next slide. First, a little bit about why I have been invited to present today. This is a photo of myself and my wife Cameron and our close friend Katya. We have been working together on this business for the business of cannabis for the last 5 years. Katya has been HIV positive for 20 years, and she has to use cannabis to maintain her health and vitality. She was baking her own marijuana chocolates and wanted help making a business of it. And I had the foresight to see that mints would be a better delivery form than truffles, with good shelf life, easy to carry, small doses, and the friendly familiarity of mints like Altoids. Next slide. Are you looking now at the bridge marketing MetaMint slide? Yes? Okay. Okay, together we have created the cannabis product MetaMints. MetaMints are packaged in child-resistant pill bottles, clearly labeled and formulated with a consistently low dose of 10 milligrams of THC. They are the safest and most trustworthy cannabis product on the market anywhere. They have been a top seller here in Colorado, and we hope they will become the Bayer aspirin of marijuana. We are now seeking business partners around the country and around the world. So if there's anyone in the audience who wants to be in the cannabis business or has a good source of CBD oil, please contact me. We intend to make CBD mints as well as the THC variety. Next slide. Behind the war on drugs. My topic starts with politics, and we can understand politics without understanding some history. And politics is about power and money. In many ways, the United States has been corrupted by its power, wealth, and capitalism. It is embarrassing the way we often hold ourselves up to be superior and exceptional, while both at home and abroad we routinely act in contradiction to our advertised values as depicted in this photograph. There is no better example of this hypocrisy and abuse of power than how we have declared a war on drugs in the name of safety and used this phony veneer to hide the true purpose of persecuting racial minorities, political dissidents, and protecting business interests. Next slide. I'm going to utilize a short video to tell how the world prohibition that we still live under was born. Would you play this slide, please?
The production of cannabis is currently banned practically everywhere in the world. The problems for cannabis began in the The production of cannabis is currently banned practically everywhere in the world. The problem The production of cannabis is currently banned practically everywhere in the world. The problems for cannabis began in the 1930s. In the wake of the Industrial Revolution, a new movement in America was born. It was called Chemergy, and it listed the very Henry Ford among its founders. Instead of abandoning agriculture to itself and directing all the investments toward the industry, this movement sought to transform and harness the agricultural output in order to integrate it into industrial production. The idea was to use agricultural products, mainly cannabis, to provide the industry with all the raw materials it needed. But there was a major handicap in making the production of cannabis truly competitive. The separation of the fiber from the stalk still needed to be done by hand, and this slowed down the production while greatly increasing the cost. But the invention of a new machine, the decorticator, seemed to remove the last barrier for cannabis, finally promising unlimited success. At that time, the magazine Popular Mechanics published a landmark article entitled New Billion-Dollar Crop, in which it envisioned a tremendous revival of cannabis plantations all around the world. But not everyone seemed to be happy with the future success of this miracle plant. At that time, the magnate of pink journalism, William Randolph Hearst, had bought millions of acres of timber forest, which he intended to use to make paper for his ever more popular tabloid publications. With the return of hemp paper, far less expensive than tree paper, his empire was doomed to collapse in a short period of time. Another industry giant who was directly threatened by the return of cannabis was Lamont DuPont, the owner of the petrochemical company that had just bought the patents to create dozens of synthetic products from oil. Nylon stockings, brushes, men's clothing, and even tires for your car. And then Orlon, Dacron, synthetic sponges, cellophane, and a full range of products that would have been easily displaced on the market by their competitors made with hemp. Apart from the risk of losing millions of dollars, Hearst and DuPont had something else in common. They were both funded by one of the most powerful bankers of the time, Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon was also the owner of Gulf Oil, one of the so-called Seven Sisters. At that time, oil companies were expanding at great speed, but were likely to see their investments vanish by the mass production of cannabis, which offered a much cleaner and more economical fuel. Nor should we forget the young pharmaceutical industry, which was financed by two other powerful bankers, John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. These people were conducting an all-out campaign to eliminate the accepted natural herbal treatments, including cannabis, from the pharmacopoeia, while trying to replace them with drugs created in the laboratory. Furthermore, Rockefeller was also the owner of Standard Oil, which had already started to invade America with its refineries and its service stations. Thus was born this natural alliance between the synthetic textile industry, the oil industry, the producers of plastics and its derivatives, and the pharmaceutical industry. They all needed to get rid of the common enemy as soon as possible. Luckily for all, at that time, Andrew Mellon was also the Secretary of the Treasury. From that powerful position, he appointed his future son-in-law, Harry Anslinger, to be the head of the new Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Harry Anslinger had already had experience as a federal agent during Prohibition. His job was now to transform the crumbling bureaucracy of Prohibition, which in the meantime had been abolished, into a new weapon to combat and eradicate cannabis from the future of the nation.
The Treasury Department intends to pursue a relentless warfare against the despicable, dope-peddling vulture who preys on the weakness of his government.
One, however, could not openly attack cannabis, which was a plant loved and respected by the vast majority. Hearst then had the brilliant idea to use the Mexican nickname marijuana, which was totally unknown to Americans at the time. In doing so, on one hand, he managed to divert the suspicions of the true objectives of the operation. On the other, by attaching the use of marijuana to blacks and Mexicans, it made it much easier to ride the growing wave of racism that was already sweeping across the country at the time.
Okay. Well, I hope you found that entertaining and a bit educational. Let's go to the next slide. Harry Enslinger, the super villain. I have nothing nice to say about this man. In 1937, cannabis and hemp officially became illegal under the leadership of this super villain. There is an outrageous story about how this law was passed in Congress late at night with little debate against the objections of the American Medical Association. Harry's campaign started with the arrest of thousands of doctors until the AMA bent to the pressure and changed its position to support the prohibition. Next slide. This quote reveals Harry's true color and nature. There are a lot of other, he started this whole campaign of yellow journalism that was kind of captured in a film called Reefer Madness that many of you have probably seen or heard of. It was quite the outrageous campaign. Next slide. His crowning achievement in 1961, the U.S. prohibition campaign became world policy through adoption at the UN of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs that is still in effect today. Harry left his position the next year after 32 years in office. Next slide. The drug war takes off. In 1971, President Richard Nixon coined the phrase and declared a war on drugs as a method to criminalize political opponents protesting the war in Vietnam. Nixon had appointed a bipartisan national commission on marijuana and drug abuse, but when they returned their findings recommending legalization, he threw away the report and declared war and marched on. Incarceration of dissidents began and freedom in America started to go downhill, or certainly from my perspective. This was also just a few years after the civil rights movement freed the blacks again from legal discrimination. I believe we have become politically much like the Soviet Union was before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Under drug war exceptions, a great number of our constitutional rights have been taken away. I myself was a victim of this war, arrested for possession of marijuana in 1972, my second year in college. It changed me as a person, but because I was a white, middle-class kid, my life was not destroyed as the lives of so many other people were. So, slide. Rates of incarceration. In the early 80s, well, this slide shows the United States rate in 1980. That's the small red or brown bar, and then the tall bar on the left shows the rate of incarceration in 2010. So that bar was that shorter red bar was even shorter when Nixon declared the war on drugs. But in the early 80s, when the AIDS epidemic broke out, President Reagan, instead of attacking that horrible plague, ramped up the war on drugs and started privatizing our prisons, letting them be run for profit. The arresting of minorities as drug criminals became a substitute for the terribly discriminatory Jim Crow laws of the early 1900s that were officially ended by our civil rights movement. Since the drug war began, over 30 million of our citizens have been arrested, 80% for simple possession of cannabis, And disproportionately, these arrests have been of minorities. Next slide. Likelihood of imprisonment. This illustrates graphically how discriminatory, racially discriminatory our laws are. Basically, to sum it up, black men are 6 times as likely to be imprisoned as white men. Latinos are 2.5 times as likely to be imprisoned as white men. The only explanation for the racial disparity in arrests and convictions is blacks and Latinos are morally inferior. There are people in the world still making this argument, but like Harry Anslinger, I believe in speaking so, they show their own low morality. Next slide. This kind of cartoon drawing makes a comparison between 19th century slavery and the 21st century war on drugs. They're two sides of the same coin. They have the same effect on the people that are subject to this jurisdiction and prosecution. By criminalizing citizens, our politicians take away their rights to housing, jobs, education, and the right to vote. Now, 1 in 7 black men no longer has the right to vote in America. Next slide, please. The prison industry in the United States. Slavery is a strong charge that I am not proud to make, but the evidence leads a rational person to no other conclusion. This goes hand in glove with the privatization of our prisons in the name of saving money. Businesses now make money locking people up, even as taxpayers are charged over $25,000 per inmate per year. Prison laborers are contracted out to industry at 25 cents per hour, effectively slave labor. Prison businesses like tough drug laws. They like high occupancy, crime, and recidivism, and have little incentive to rehabilitate their tenants. Next slide. Is it time to end the war on drugs? I hope this audience will agree that the right answer is yes. I put this slide in to come full circle. The challenge we face in ending this war, is from the same type of people and business interests that started the war 75 years ago. This is an endless war for money, power over people, and nothing more. Next slide. Why you think cannabis is illegal and why cannabis is really legal. Now, this image is probably too complex for people to see in detail, but it makes a really good point. So let me try a quick explanation we're looking at. The green boxes in the middle, top and bottom, are the same, both showing the vast number of uses of a marijuana and cannabis plant. In the top box, the beneficial uses are hidden by the blue paint. And the red lines all converge in the center and say, look here, there's THC, people getting high, drugs are bad. The images on both sides are image of Harry Anslinger's hysterical reefer madness campaign, which still echoes into the present day. In the bottom box, we can read the beneficial uses, but they are again marked out with red X's because alternative competing goods are being made by all the major companies in the world that have an interest in cannabis remaining illegal, and so it is. If you want to know the truth, follow the money. Power corrupts. Next slide. Okay, so now Colorado and Washington have legalized marijuana for recreational use. For those of you who are geographically challenged, that's Colorado in the middle and Washington State up in the upper left-hand corner. It was the need to bring cannabis medicine to the victims of the AIDS epidemic that finally led the citizens of California to pass the first state law legalizing medical marijuana in 1996. Now, almost 20 years later, 22 of our 50 legalized medical marijuana. So the movement forward has been slow but steady and seems to be reaching a tipping point. At last, the majority of U.S. citizens are in favor of legalization, but 2 states have legalized adult recreational use. Colorado became the first in January, followed by Washington State in July. And yet it's still all medical use, all cannabis and hemp is illegal still under federal laws. Next slide. Fear, greed, racism, and ignorance. Campaigns to legalize adult use had failed in 2004. It was noticed in follow-up surveys that 1/3 of people believe that pot is more harmful than alcohol. Another 1/3 of Americans consider marijuana to be equally as harmful as alcohol. People were voting against legalization based on fear of the unknown, racism, and ignorance. They said, look at all the problems we have with alcohol and tobacco. We don't need another dangerous drug made legal. 70 years of state propaganda has worked to make huge numbers of our citizens ignorant and fearful on this subject, unable to vote in their best interest. Next slide. Marijuana is safer. This is a book cover, book I highly recommend, that gives the history, kind of a manual of how the change occurred here in Colorado. Voters feared that legalization would be adding another vice. Thanks to Mason Tavert and his associates, the counter argument became, we would not be adding a vice, we will be allowing adults the option to use a less harmful alternative for relaxation and recreation. Give free adults free choice to make a safer decision for themselves. Next slide. The SAFER campaign. So the answer was to educate people about marijuana by comparing it directly to alcohol, which we all know a great deal about. In 2005, a campaign began in Colorado under the new banner, Safer Alternative for Enjoyable Recreation. Next slide. So here we see the direct comparison between marijuana and alcohol. How marijuana heals and alcohol damages health, etc. I think these are arguments most of you would be very familiar with. Alcohol is clearly more dangerous, but 2/3 of our population doesn't know this. The challenge is education. If we can present the facts, that leaves opponents of legalization to argue from a position of hypocrisy or absurdity. We win logical arguments based on facts. Next slide. Beer, wine, safer. This campaign was tested first at the state's 2 leading universities, where students are directly exposed to the dangers of alcohol, binge drinking, violence, and sexual assault. Referendums on both campuses passed to enforce laws equitably with respect to cannabis and alcohol. As things are typically on campuses, the drinking age for alcohol is 21, but it's very common for underclassmen, 18, 20, and 21-year-olds, to get alcohol and drink with no severe consequences, no severe legal consequences or academic consequences. However, if a student is caught smoking pot, the consequences can be terribly severe, expulsion or and such. So this was quite a step to take on the university campus. Parents were asked, if your daughter is walking home alone late at night and she encounters a group of men, would you rather they be drunk or high? Next slide. Variations on this campaign went on for 7 years before achieving victory in 2012 in the form of an amendment to our state constitution. The foundation of the campaign was education to counter decades of propaganda. The second emphasis, revenues from taxes on the sale of marijuana should go to public services like schools rather than to drug cartels in Mexico. Third, law enforcement resources should be directed to serious crimes, not to marijuana arrest. Next slide. This ad campaign was clearly meant to show that using cannabis was a reasonable choice for white adults, not just young people and blacks, addicts and hippies. Next slide. The opposition campaign played on fears that legalization would increase availability and use by teens and kids, and even ads indicating that we would become a society of zombies with our usage rates doubling or tripling. Things that have not come to pass. Next slide. Please card my son. This ad made the point that it was, and it is, very easy for kids to get black market marijuana at their schools. Much easier than to get alcohol and tobacco. A regulated market is accountable and safer in ways that the black market will never be. Next slide. In November 2012, Amendment 64 passed, getting more votes in favor than Obama did for his first presidency. Notice that there is a 60 million, right-hand column says there is a $60 million in taxes and savings projected annually in this state of 5 million people. Next slide. So we're 6 months into this experiment. And here are the basics, the quick results. 10,000 people will not be arrested this year for drug possession. Well over $10 million are being raised in taxes. Sales are projected to exceed $500 million. There's been a 10% decrease in overall crime. There's been a tremendous increase in tourism, and 10,000 new jobs related to the industry have been created. Next slide. One of the surprises is that marijuana edibles have done phenomenally well, representing up to half of the total sales in the market here. They're discreet, convenient, the effects last longer, and they're easy to track, and they have none of the problems associated with smoking. Next slide. There have been bad effects from the edibles as well. Our use of sweets as a delivery system for this potent drug is really unprecedented. When you eat marijuana medicine, the onset of effects is much slower than we're used to with smoking. So what happens is people wait 5 minutes or 10 or 15 or 30 minutes. They don't feel the effects and they eat more. And this results in overdosing. Now, I don't think this elevates to the level of a failure. The sky has not fallen. There's no rampant insanity and mayhem, and our women are not having sex with the darkies, as Harry Anslinger warned us about, at least not any more than usual. But there have been problems. Next slide, please. There's been dosage confusion. As I said, the edible experience is different from the smoking experience. And I think we're just on this learning curve. But part of the learning curve problem is this delivery form of sweet. And when is the last time you had 1/6 of a cookie or 1/10 of a brownie? It's just not the way we consume sweets. So people overdose. Now, one thing I would say about overdosing, it's not like with other drugs. These are overdoses that make people feel uncomfortable. But you sleep, you hang out on the couch, and maybe you're paranoid, but you watch TV, and 8 or 10 hours later, it's over with, and you're fine. And that's not the case with any other drug. So next slide. But we have had bad news. There was a 19-year-old student who fell to his death from a hotel balcony after eating one cookie. That was 6 doses. And candy apples have been taken to schools by teenagers and kids. So these stories have been sensational, and they've gotten a lot of attention. But I think it's just part of the learning curve that we're on, and we've certainly been responsive to it. Next slide. And one way we've been responsive is with products like Metamins. We present ourselves as the leader in safety and responsibility. So, next slide. Challenges internal. Our use of sweets as a delivery system, as I said, is unprecedented. And we're going to continue to have problems with this delivery form as people experience it for the first time. So we need to do a better job with safe packaging and labeling, have better control, more and more education, and motivating people to be engaged, active, and speak out and vote. Next slide. This is meant to answer the question of challenges external. The external challenge is that there are still businesses and organizations that have a vested interest in the status quo. They're greedy, they're racist, they're ignorant, and they don't want to change things. And I'm going to sum up with our opportunity. Next slide. Legalize hemp. It can save our planet. As Jack Harris says, I don't know if hemp's going to save the world, but I'll tell you this, it's the only thing that can. It shouldn't be a crop to heal, to grow your own medicine, to feel better, to feel pleasure. We can't have freedom without freedom of speech. We can't have freedom of speech if we can't control our own minds. And we don't need Big Brother to control our minds. We have to do this together. We can. Momentum is on our side. So let's keep it up. Yes, weed cannabis. That's my conclusion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gabrel. Are you still online? Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation and for joining our Congress. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, we have one question.
Hello? If I heard heard you right, you said that when you take too much of cookie, you only fall down and sleep. Did I heard that correctly?
Well, you can have a variety of symptoms, but there's no toxicity, there's no lasting medical effects. So, after 12 hours, people are completely normal. That's my understanding.
Because I know people that went to a mental institution when they ate too much cookies.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?
I know people that went to a mental institution when they ate too much cookies.
Well, I think, maybe they were already crazy. I don't think it was the marijuana cookie that caused them the problem to go to an institution.
Yeah, it was, I just told it for an information. It's too much paranoia. People get paranoid and afraid. Quite afraid. It was some when they overdose, they don't sleep, they shake for hours and hours. And they feel terrible.
Well,
I just say this for an information, so.
Well, I think people do feel uncomfortable for a period of time, and that can include paranoia and anxiety. Yes. And for decades, there's been plenty of reason for them to be paranoid if they're using cannabis. And that's very unfortunate. But in my opinion, the negative consequences of our making cannabis illegal have been much, much more harmful than any effects that we experience from the use of the plant.
Okay, I agree with you, but these people that were afraid didn't use marijuana. They just now and then they use it, not all the time. And so because when you take too much alcohol, you throw up, and if you shake for a couple of hours and you feel terrible, it's quite an unpleasant experience.
Yes.
Any other questions? Okay, we've got one more question.
Good morning again, Mr. Gabriel. How do you see the global trends towards legalization? Because you described very well the American situation. How do you see the global situation?
Well, I can't say that I have a very good understanding of the global situation. Something interesting I heard at a conference here in Denver recently is that the monetary value of the medical marijuana market in the United States is currently $1.4 billion, and that the world market for medical marijuana is $4 billion. So that indicates to me that the medical marijuana market outside of the United States is growing just as fast and maybe faster in some cases than it is here. I like, except for what we're experiencing currently in Colorado and Washington State, I would like to think that in many other countries of the world, progress is being made faster. So I think the progress is worldwide, and I think that's the great hope and opportunity that we have, given technology such as we're using now, that change and progress can take place worldwide at a much faster rate than ever before in history, just because we have such accelerated communication. The biggest change that I've experienced and see here in the United States and certainly in Colorado over the last 5 years is that there's been an exponential growth in communication and information about cannabis. Just in the past year, I have dove into reading about cannabis and have been really amazed to discover how much good and new literature and how much there is to be learned about the history and the plant. And at this point, I would like you to, if it's still possible, go to the next slide. And there is a reading list that I would like to share and recommend. Okay. There's several, well, all these books are excellent, and if you would like me to comment on any of them, I'd be happy to do so. You know, cannabis and hemp have been a part of the world economy and world culture for as long as we know. I believe we have co-evolved with the plant. One of the remarkable things that I've learned about that's really not covered in these particular texts is about the discovery 10 years ago of the endocannabinoid system. We have a biological system in our body, all of us, and all mammals have this system too, that it is a really complex and sophisticated monitoring and balancing system of all of our organs, and the messengers, the communication in this is with cannabinoids. We make cannabinoids internally, but they're almost identical with the cannabinoids that we get from smoking or ingestion. So there's just so much to be learned about this amazing plant.
Thank you, Mr. Gabrel. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we are tight on our schedule and we have to continue with the next speaker. Thank you once again for joining us and for sharing this wonderful information with us and your great work.